So, welcome to Deep Dives Decode on Ukraine and the truth and history of it on genedecode.org. This is the most important decode we've done. If you have not already watched and listened to and participated and backed up the Ukraine envisioning, it's on Real Gene Decode. The link was put up on Q Storm Rider. It's also available on Deep Dives. So this amazing decode, incredible research and write-up was done by Sinrata, Bliss for Service Coordinator. Ukraine. What's happening in Ukraine is a holy war against globalism, Satanism, Tartaria versus Khazaria, a spiritual religious war against orthodoxy. And as Klaus Schwab of the WEF has said, it's the end of the New World Order. As Alex in Greece often says, if you don't follow him, he's one of the two people on the Duran. I highly recommend it. It's the beginning of a fair world order. It's the keystone. When Ukraine ends being a satanic Nazi regime and cleared out of that mess, their demise is certain. In this document, we will use the word Zionist or for emphasis prior to the words Jew or Jewish to the Khazarian Jews. And that's, we refer to it as Khazarian Jew or Zionist Jew. These are the satanic Luciferian people who stole the Jewish religion and culture generations ago. The Jewish people, of all people on earth, are probably the worst demonized and taken over within their upper lineage. And you're going to find in this decodes, this is part one. There'll be a part two following up very quickly. We'll be reading that in very shortly. And you'll find out in these two that they got into leadership, took over, and they actually set them up to destroy their top leadership so they could take it. And by take it, I mean kill off the top leaders. So they are not from the bloodline of Abraham. We will use the word Hebrew to refer to the people often called the Jews, who are the genuine people from the bloodline of Abraham. When looking at historical maps of the Ukraine territory, two names are used to identify the area of current Ukraine. These are Tartaria and Khazaria. This area has been embattled in a perpetual war between good and evil, between God and Satan. The president of the Republic of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, called the Special Military Operation, now often just referred to as SMO for the first letters of that started a little over a year ago on the 24th of February, 2022. Quote, a holy war against Banderite Nazis and Shaitans, quote, end. Satan worshippers, in other words. He also says that Ukraine needs to be de-Satanized. The Army of the Republic of Chechnya is the leading force in fighting this war. So, in my understanding and research, the Russian people are pretty close to 100% human. The so-called Karars or Khazarians are Satan worshippers and are not human, but mostly mankind at best. And negative alien agenda groups, half-breeds, or worse. And I've spoken to that on the interview with Patriot Underground with Terry Cassidy about the groups that are fighting in Bakhmut. It's why they're heavily invested. They're not pulling out. They, even when the head of the Ukraine military told Zelensky that they should pull out, he said no. And now they're operationally, if not actually completely encircled. When I checked yesterday, it was 2 miles short of being totally encircled, but it means that they were operationally, it means all the roads except dirt roads were taken, and the dirt road was mud to get out of there, and tanks were getting stuck and becoming targets. And 5 or 6 people were getting through fields in a day. That was about it, of the 14,000 men in there. So that's likely now completely encircled, but even on that last remaining dirt road, it's just bombarded by the Russian, which is mostly the Wagner group. And the Ukrainians are trying to mount a counteroffensive in two nearby towns to break back through. And their idea is not to help them evacuate, it's to continue to defend it. And they're sending all of their best from all over what's left of their Ukrainian military forces on the Eastern Front to that area now. Khazaria. Let's take a closer look at some ancient maps of Khazaria and Tartaria. Here's a map from 1780 showing the landscape of this area during the Roman Empire. And you can see here the Black Sea, they call it Mare Negrum, or not sure how you pronounce that word correctly nowadays. Black Sea is how we know it now, showing Khazar presence in the Crimea and coastal regions. This is Rigobert Bone, Imperi Romani Distracta. I won't attempt to read all this. You can read that. It's just kind of crazy. So on this map, Crimea is called Khazaria. You can see that right here. It should be mentioned that Crimea is a very important territory for Russia and was therefore reintegrated into the Russian Federation in 2014. This map below, from the time of Charles the Great, born in 747, shows where Khazaria spread into the territory that has now been liberated from Ukraine by Russia during the special military operation that started in February 2022. So this Khazar Empire map of Europe in the age of Charles the Great by Karl von Spooner, who's you can see the information on there. You can now see the area that we know as Ukraine laid out, and again, the Black Sea. On this third map below, Khazaria is located similarly to the previous maps on the territory of today's East Ukraine and West Ukraine. So you see Khazaria, again, the Black Sea, and the various area that we now think of as Ukraine. And you can see here the Franks coming in, the Empire of the Franks, up through in the Carpathians and all of this area. And as I stated, this NAA group landed in two areas, Bakhmut and in the area of Carpathian Mountains and the Pontic Steppes. All these maps can be found at the link below, which is here. The map of Khazaria below goes into the territory of Kazakhstan on current maps to the Caspian Sea, which in the past was called the Khazarian Sea. That map is available at this link. So I'd like to introduce our next reader who will read for you the Khazarian people, and I'll explain the map, the Khazar Khaganate. It's just circa 650 through 850, and you can now see the area around the Black Sea of what we call Ukraine expanding, and it's actually, some of it goes up into what we now know as Russia.
The Khazars were a nomadic Turkic people of Caucasian descent who originated in Central Asia and came to dominate the North Caucasian steppe located between the Black and Caspian Seas in the 7th century AD. They were first recorded as arriving in the Pontic steppe by the Roman writer Priscus in the mid-5th century, and relatively soon became an important part of the Byzantium's diplomatic system. Despite the name, the Khazar state was a multi-ethnic and multi-confessional. The Khazars constituted merely an elite core that also included Slavs, Tatars, Central Asian Avars, Laks, Caucasian Avars, Alans, Aka-Oshetians, Chechens, Ingush, Leskings, Dargins, Kabardians, Adjigas, Ubiks, Abkhaz, Swans, Mikrelians, Georgians, and Caucasian Albanians, as well as other peoples. Although many Khazar aristocrats converted to Judaism, there were also many Christians, Muslims, pagans, animists, and Tankrism. It also reported that there existed a Khazarian kingdom with kings who ruled for 40 years each. In 1969, the Khazar state was effectively destroyed by the onslaught of armies under the leadership of Sviatoslav I of Kievan Rus, and the Khazars ultimately dispersed and/or became absorbed by other North Caucasian peoples. It is also said that they went underground for 100 years. The Khazar aristocrats were not trusted and were considered to be very crazy. Once you traveled into their land, they would rob people and then they would follow them into their homeland and assume their identity. In the 6th century, they took over England, and in the 10th century, they went for Germany. The Russian Tsar, fed up with this, forced them to choose one of the 3 Abrahamic religions: Jewish, Muslim, or Christian. They chose the Jewish faith and used all its sacred knowledge from Solomon to recreate it into the Talmudic Judaism of today's Zionists. Judaism was a convenient religion in which to hide and continue their worshipping of Moloch, symbolized by the owl, Baal, Lucifer, and Satan, and utilize black magic to realize their aims. Khazars do extensive rituals with child sacrifice that include torture, blood drinking, and cannibalism of human children. What they practice is Babylonian Talmudism as a kind of secret Satanism. The rabbis teach that in the 8th century, the entire nation of Khazaria converted from paganism to the Talmud and Kabbalistic Judaism. Christianity had too many tax-paying obligations, and Islam was too weak for them. They also invented the word Jew, but they are Khazarian Zionists masquerading as real Jews.
So I want to note here that the lower level Jewish people are not the Khazarian Jews, which are the Zionist Jews. The Khazarian Jews are the Zionist Jews. So the Zionist Jew are actually a non-terrestrial group that came to Earth in the areas I mentioned before. They landed in the Pontic Steppes and the Carpathian Mountains and in Bakhmut. I will be doing a full decode on this later in following decodes. The Zionist Jew are one of the Blessed for Service team. Well, the Zionist Jew and the Khazarian Jewish people are the same, but they are not the Jewish people of Abraham's descent, who are Hebrews and the true Jewish people. The true Jewish people of that lineage had their leadership infiltrated by the Khazarian Zionist Satan and worshiping non-terrestrial beings. For the rest of this decode, the term used for Khazarian Zionist Jew will be Khazarian Zionist, or a red asterisk be put. So if you see a red asterisk, that tells you who we're referring to. Make it very easy. In situations where articles are referenced or within an article used in the term Jew or Jewish may be used, when this does not refer to the true Jewish people of the bloodline of Abraham, be accompanied by a red asterisk. It is to be understood that the authors of this decode realize the true evil is the Zionist Jew. It's not the Jewish people in and of the totality thereof. So other authors do not necessarily realize this difference. So just wanted to bring that to everybody's attention, that a lot of these links and things, people will attack the Jewish people. I know many fine Jewish people. Roseanne Barr, a very good friend of mine, introduced to me by a very amazing person who got my name out there quite a bit. I'm sure you know who I'm referring to. So go ahead.
As mentioned previously, the Khazarians were and are into human and child trafficking and child sacrifice. Adopting the sordid, occultic sex symbol of the six-pointed star, the pagan Khazars, known for centuries as the diabolical serpent people, battled against both Christians and Islamists. These Khazarian Zionists, Jewish converts, emigrated to Eastern Europe and especially to Ukraine, Russia, Poland, and Lithuania. They also conquered Armenia. Today, they are found mostly in the USA and Israel. In 1948, the Khazars, falsely calling themselves Jews, arrived in the territory of Palestine and established the State of Israel. The people of Israel today are virtually all of Khazar, Turk, Mongol stock extraction. The Khazarian Zionists have no genetic claims to the land of Israel and no family connection whatsoever to the true Hebrews of historical Israel. It is well known that sometime in the 8th to 9th centuries, the Khazars, a warlike Turkic people, converted to Judaism and ruled over a vast domain in what became southern Russia and Ukraine. What happened to them after the Russians destroyed that empire around the 11th century has been a mystery. Many have speculated that the Khazars became the ancestors of the Ashkenazi Zionists, another offshoot of the Khazarian Zionists. In 2012, Israeli researcher Eran El-Haik published a study claiming to prove that Khazarian ancestry is the single largest element in the Ashkenazi gene pool. The Khazars infiltrated all the monarchs in Europe and replaced them with their own bastard offspring. They then went to the American continent and infiltrated all of the power structures there. The nobility became black because the Khazarians took them over. The last time they tried to take over Russia, the remains of Tartaria was under Tsar Nicholas. They killed nearly the entire Romanov family in 1918. Only Anastasia survived. In this color revolution, calling themselves Bolsheviks, they installed their own Khazarian government and implemented communism. During their rulership, approximately 100 million Russians died, many ruthlessly slaughtered by their installed leader, Stalin. It was not until 1989 and the fall of the communist Soviet Union that the Russian people got their country back.
So Putin is quite frequently speaking to this time frame in which the name changers, the Khazars, took over the country, calling themselves the Bolsheviks at that time, backed by the West. By Kuhn & Bank, Jacob Schiff made transfers of 100 million, 150 million the first time, 150 million again during World War II. And that money actually went on a train from Berlin straight to Moscow, and it went into a tunnel and it was stopped and offloaded. $18 million disappeared. Watch the movie Hogan's Heroes goes into that, where they moved it to a bank, and then a bunch of American renegade kind of guys came down and helped advance the Allies' front line, but their purpose was to get that gold, and they split it with the Germans guarding because they didn't know what they were guarding. That's actually very accurate. So you must understand that the leading Bolsheviks who took over Russia were not Russians. They hated Russians. Driven by ethnic hatred, they tortured and slaughtered millions of Russians without a shred of remorse. It cannot be overstated. Bolshevism committed the greatest human slaughter of all time. The fact that the most of the world is ignorant and uncaring about this enormous crime is proof that the global media is in the hands of the perpetrators. And that was Alexander Solzhenitsyn that said that. And if you haven't seen, there's many videos out that show some of this slaughter and the horrific pogrom held by Stalin, where he killed over 100 million Russians. Again, not Russian, Khazarian. So this is an utter genocide travesty that was done to the Russian people. And that we see the same thing going on in Ukraine. They're in the Carpathians, they're grabbing Hungarians preferably, and also Polish people. And when the overthrow of Ukraine happened in the early 1900s, they killed thousands of Polish people, and they fought back with scythes and pitchforks and killed a couple thousand Ukrainians to get them to stop. And the same thing continues. The neo-Nazi globalists in Ukraine, and you can actually see, instead of like in a soccer match or a football match in the US where the wave goes around, they do the Sieg Heil salute, which is actually a Hail Satan. And so that'll go around. And they actually, the global neocon globalists welcome them in because they're Nazi, or in other words, Khazarian is another word for that as well. And in this, they actually are a breed of beyond the common persons like we had in the time of Hitler in Germany, because those in Ukraine feel they're not only God's chosen race, their God, Satan, but they're above and beyond all the others. They're Banderites, so they're the preferred race, even beyond the other Nazis. We'll get rid of them too when they're done. So go ahead. Thank you.
International Zionists, bankers of Hamburg, London, and New York financed this attempt. Zionists controlled German banks under the leadership of Max Warburg as early as 1914, sent large payments to Lenin and Trotsky to bring down the Tsar. As part of that conspiracy, Jacob Schiff, head of the New York Zionist banking house Kuhn and Loeb, invested $20 million, which in 2023 would be close to $2.5 billion, to bring down the Tsar. Shortly after that huge investment, the media wrote that socialism became a movement of the Bolshevik masses in Russia.
He personally invested $20 million of the $150 million aforementioned. Go ahead.
The revolution was won by the Bolsheviks, who successfully fought the native Russians. Employees appointed by the Zionists filled the ranks of the Bolshevik government in the Soviet Union. After the purge of Stalin in 1956 under Nikita Khrushchev, up to 50% of these still worked employees in government departments. The Khazars are referred to as the Khazarian Mafia, abbreviated as KM. In 2014, the news reported that Syrian rebels planned to give Israel to Golan Heights in exchange for the creation of a no-fly zone against the Syrian Assad regime. In an even bolder move, it is now revealed that Israel will withdraw its settlers from communities beyond the settlement blocks and relocate them, at least temporarily, to Ukraine. Ukraine made this arrangement on the basis of historic ties and in exchange for desperately needed military assistance against Russia.
Again, this shows exactly the narrative. If you haven't watched Garland Nixon's expose on this just recently, of the hypocrisy of the Western side, NATO, EU, and US, etc., and what's happening in Ukraine. And we're saying to China, it's a red line if you supply weapons to help Russia. And in the meantime, we're in Syria. The US has military and 1,000 military men in a base in Syria. They supplied this separatist regime that's offering the Golan Heights. They're, in other words, the same group to the Israeli government, for a no-fly zone. And they're against the Syrian Assad. They've been trying to do a color revolution against Assad for a very, very long time. And that part of Syria that the US took is where all the oil is. And we're shipping all the oil out of their country. Like we're saying, much of the EU and NATO leadership is saying, we'll break Russia up, overthrow Putin, and administer it for the people. Like we're doing in Syria, taking administer their resources for us. That's what they mean.
This surprising turn of events had an even more surprising origin, that of genetics, a field in which Israeli scholars have long excelled. The Ukrainian invitation for the Zionists to return was a godsend for them. Relocating all the settlers within Israel in a short time would have been difficult both logistically and economically. Another fastlan, like the expulsion of the settlers in Gaza, Hitnakut, disengagement, is certainly undesirable. All Zionists wishing to return to Ukraine would be welcomed back as citizens without conditions and would be regarded even more highly if they were to take part in the promised infusion of massive Israeli military assistance, including troops, equipment, and the construction of new bases. If the initial transfer worked, other West Bank settlers would be encouraged to relocate to Ukraine as well. In theory, following this, Ukraine, bolstered by Israeli support, would re-establish control over all its territory, and the current autonomous Republic of Crimea would once again become an autonomous Zionist domain. The small-scale successor to the medieval empire of Khazaria, as the peninsula too was once known, would then be called Khazaria, a Yiddish name.
So we left this word in. If you go and research what that word means, it's actually a derogatory term, and yet they're using it for themselves. It's really revealing how they actually use words and what they mean and what they really mean. So that I feel that's God.
واثبت الغرب انه ليس لديه اصدقاء ولا يوجد لديه اعداء، يوجد لديه عدو واحد وكل من يقف في وجه مصالحه الماديه، فيعني لا الشيوعيه ولا الاسلام ولا النازيه ولا الصين ولا روسيا ولا غيرها هم اعداء للغرب. اذا كانوا يلبوا المصالح فهم اصدقاء، اذا كانوا يقفوا ضد المصالح فهم اعداء، يعني المبادئ صفر. لكن اخر حقيقه وهي من اشد الحقائق قبحا وقل من الناس تعرف عنها هي كذبه ان الغرب ضد النازيه وان الصهيونيه ضد النازيه. القله تعرف بان النازيين في اوكرانيا وهي منظمات نازيه عملت بشكل وثيق مع هتلر امنيا وعسكريا وعقائديا. عندما انتهت الحرب العالميه الثانيه اخرج القاده البعض منهم الى اوروبا والبعض منهم الى امريكا، وفي الخمسينيات طلبت CIA الاداره الامريكيه ان يرفع القبض عن هذه المجموعات النازيه لانها ضروره لامريكا في اوكرانيا التي كانت جزء من الاتحاد السوفيتي. وما يؤكد هذا الكلام اليوم، هذا الكلام التاريخي، ان زيلينسكي هو صهيوني يهودي ولكنه يدعم المنظمات القوميه المتطرفه التي قاتلت في الحرب العالميه الثانيه عندما دخل هتلر وشارك جزء منها في المذابح ضد اليهود. فكيف يكون هذا الصهيوني اليهودي داعم لهذه المنظمات؟ والغرب يدعم هذه المنظمات التي تسمى اليوم منظمه ازوف اليمينيه، واسرائيل الصهيونيه التي تجتر ذكرى البكاء على ضحايا المحرقه تدعم زعيما يدعم النازيه التي قتلت اليهود. هذا يؤكد بان الغرب يكذب في كل ما يقول، والغرب لا يهمه سوى ان يسيطر على العالم، ان يتحكم بالعالم، وان ينهب الموارد ويملا خزائنه بالاموال.
Heavenly Jerusalem. As part of this discussion, the project of the Heavenly Jerusalem has to be mentioned.
So in
And
this map of Heavenly Jerusalem that Samrata put here, you can see, it's a little hard to read. This is Odessa, which was founded by Catherine the Great, and you can see the Kherson, Zaporozhye, Luhansk, and all these districts that are now back into being part of Russia. And interesting here, as you can see, Solomon and other items. So the secrets of Solomon and all that were added to the quote Jewish faith that they took, that made it Talmudic Judaism.
An advanced group of Jewish settlers led by a non-Jew, Igor Berkut, began preparing the infrastructure to receive the first 100,000 Israelis. Their arrival and resettlement in the territory of New Jerusalem in the Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and Nikolaev regions was expected to continue until mid-2018. By the end of 2022, a total of 6 million Jews from Israel and more than 12 million from Russia, the US, and the EU countries were expected to arrive in the new motherland to create the main center of world Jewry. This area is exactly that part of Ukraine which is in the focus of the special military operation by the Russian state. The area is almost identical with Novorossiya. The Heavenly Jerusalem project is a practical answer to the predictions of the well-informed political heavyweight Henry Kissinger and the late Palestinian prophet Sheikh Yassin that by 2022 to 2025, Jews living in the current territory of Israel would become impossible due to the aggressiveness of the surrounding Muslim population, natural anomalies, and the coming catalysm of the Battle of the End. Henry Kissinger stated in 2012, according to Igor Berkut, who is revered by many in Israel as Mashiach ben Yosef, money and decisive breakthrough technologies for Heavenly Jerusalem will be given by the largest banking corporations and global multinational companies.
So, you know, on this Heavenly Jerusalem map, and now you can see also they're backing it. The big bankers are backing this motherlode, as Kissinger stated here, that this person would, according to Igor Berkut, is Messiah ben Yosef. And again, the Heavenly Jerusalem map and the republics, as they wanted them to be, this is what their plan was for this reason. Donetsk, you can see where they continued to go after Donetsk, and how this would all be part of Heavenly Jerusalem, and all these millions of, quote, Jewish people would come from all over the world to be new Heavenly Jerusalem in what we call Ukraine. And there's Crimea again, you can see there. And it's interesting, they excluded that, but now they're saying Crimea has to be taken.
Igor Gecko Berkut was called in Israel the forerunner of the Messiah or Ben Moshiach. He has already landed in Odessa with the first group of colonists from Israel. Additionally, with him was the former Israeli politician Yaakov Kedmi. He was engaged in the repatriation of Jews from the USSR to Israel, and he understands perfectly how to return these Jews to Ukraine. Even the Jewish Ukraine President Zelensky stated on Jewish TV in June 22 that Ukraine will become Big Israel.
So this is where you can see he was, Zelensky is probably green screen. our stage screen here, was talking that Ukraine will be more like big Israel than Europe in the wake of the Russian war. They would become part of NATO and the EU, and they'd be known as big Israel. So it's important to note that the United States always calls Israel the state of Israel, as in one of the 50 states. We provide tons of funding since the inception of the state of Israel. And hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, have gone into that.
But this did not work out as they had planned because Putin invaded Crimea in 2014. Did he know about their plans? The 2012 genetic discoveries by Dr. Aaron El-Haik of the prestigious Johns Hopkins Medical University found that Zionist Jews are not from ancient Israel, but originated in Khazaria. The admission by the Israelis that the Zionists are not related to ancient Israeli Hebrews, but to Khazaria is stunning to say the least. Their findings have been backed up by other high-level scientific research. Walt reports that, quote, a blue ribbon team of scholars from leading research institutions and museums, quote end, was appointed to study the DNA. Quote, having heard of the report, quote end, Netanyahu said off the record, quote, we first thought that admitting we are really Khazars was one way to get around Abbas's insistence that no Jew can remain in a Palestinian state, quote end.
So it's important again to note that there are Khazarian Satan-worshipping globalists. That's who they are. The Jews and the Jews that are of the blood. There's the neocon Jews and the Jews that are of the bloodline of Abraham. I recommend everyone research the transfer agreement. We'll have that in this Decode. It's signed by the aforementioned Khazarian elitist, satanic worshipping Jews and Hitler himself. In this agreement, the true Jewish people were sent to Palestine. The wealth that these had, they could pay for this to be done for them. So they could, before World War II started, be transferred to Palestine in this, what was known as the transfer agreement or the Avar agreement. A few links are below so that you can research this. Also, the following page will show a document that's a person signing and giving an amount in silver coin. With this agreement, the true Jewish bloodline of Abraham that had wealth and power, but were not of the wealthy and powerful Khazarian Zionist Jews, were thrown under the bus to be killed by the KM, to be murdered by them in Palestine so that they could get rid themselves once and for all of those they deem useless eaters, the lineage of Jewish people of the bloodline of Abraham. So we'll be hopefully trying to do this as a full decode later, but this is an example of document you'll see. And this is actually as you can see, a copy of an original document in which it was signed, where they're part of this transfer agreement.
So on with Netanyahu's statement. Quote, maybe we were grasping at straws, but when he refused to accept that, it forced us to think about more creative solutions, quote end. Throughout history, Khazars were known for identity theft. Quote, the Ukrainian invitation for the Jews to return was a godsend. Relocating all the settlers within Israel in a short time would be difficult for reasons of logistics and economics. We certainly don't want another fashlan like the expulsion of the settlers in Gaza, quote end. The book, The Invention of the Jewish People by Tel Aviv University professor and historian Shlomo Zand has made a big noise. An Israeli scholar argues that the nation of Israel simply does not exist and claims that their origin from the Middle East is a myth meant to justify the existence of the state of Israel. European Zionists, however, are the descendants of the Khazar Turks. Other sources say that the Khazars were not of Turkish descent.
The Zionists have taken charge of Ukraine's ravaged government and finances and intend to eventually make it their second homeland. Several years ago, military equipment and settlers were sent from Israel to Ukraine. Their plan, leaked by governmental insiders, came only after Netanyahu and his cabinet reviewed growing DNA genetic evidence that the Zionist Jews are not the descendants of Abraham, but instead came from Khazaria, of which Kiev, Ukraine, is the heartland. In fact, the Zionist Jews of Israel and the US are of Ukrainian heritage, according to some researchers. Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, is considered to be the modern capital of the Khazars. Kiev is also the birthplace of the Russian people and is older than Moscow and St. Petersburg. Today, DNA science reveals that a majority of all the Jews in the world come from Khazaria.
So this is especially true of those in position in banking, politics, media, and power. These are the Satan-worshiping globalist Zionist elite Jewish that are not remotely related to Abraham. The true Jews are the progeny of Abraham and continue to be slaughtered and killed for the elitists. This is what is currently happening in the Ukraine conflict.
The people who claim to be Jewish and are in positions of power and or wealth are not of the bloodline lineage of Abraham and the prophets, but of King Bulan and the pagan peoples of the Caucasus. The ancestors of today's Zionist Jews are not Israelites, but are Khazarians, such as the Pacers, Rothschilds, Rockefellers, etc. DNA science upholds recent discoveries in history and archaeology and provides the world with a correct and remarkable picture of the true Jewish people. The Khazars, identified in Revelation 2 and 3 as the wicked synagogue of Satan, are further identified in Ezekiel 38 and 39, prophetically as the people of Gog from the land of Magog. Prophecy clearly tells us that this warlike serpentine people shall invade and conquer Israel first, then go on to plunge the entire planet into chaos and warfare. Revelation 20. It is well known that sometime in the 8th and 9th centuries, the Khazars, a warlike Turkic people, converted to Judaism and ruled over a vast domain in what became southern Russia and Ukraine. What happened to them after the Russians destroyed that empire around the 11th century has become a mystery. Many have speculated that the Khazars became the ancestors of Ashkenazi Jews. They were kicked out of the country and went for 100 years into the underground. Israel's secret plan was to migrate from Khazaria to Israel and then to return back to Khazaria, Ukraine. The Zionist plan is to conquer the nation of Ukraine, goal of their new world order, i.e., complete rule of the entire earth. The prophecy declared in Ezekiel 38:39 says that in the last days, Gog, the demonic ruler of the land of Magog, shall come against Israel, which is brought forth out of the nations. He shall conquer this land of unwalled villages and take them hostage. Who is Gog, and where is the land of Magog? Now, with new and astonishing archaeological and genetic discoveries, we have amazing evidence that Magog is situated in southern Russia, in the Caucasus, and Gog is the name of the ruler of the kingdom of Khazaria. Khazaria is the land of the non-Semitic Turkic peoples who falsely claim to be Jews. As mentioned previously, in 1948, the Khazarians went to Palestine, where they conquered the peaceful Palestinians and set up a pretentious new kingdom of Israel. The Khazarians, claiming to be Jews, are actually from the bloodline of Gog. According to Revelation, they will be led by Satan's Gog, and in the last days they are destined to plunge the entire world into bloodshed, chaos, and war. This is according to Ezekiel 38 and 39. It is not quite disgusting to witness the suffering of the Ukrainian and Russian peoples in Ukraine that are being oppressed and massacred by the arrogant Zionists who have, with America's help, now become the slave masters of Ukraine. to such an extent that they have reopened concentration camps and are filling them up with native Ukrainians. Israel's oligarchs, under Petro Poroshenko's iron hand, are dividing up the spoils of their Ukrainian takeover. The end result of their devious plan is two Zionist Jewish homelands, Israel and Ukraine. What's more, the Israeli government promises an infusion of massive Israeli military assistance to Ukraine, including troops, equipment, and construction of new bases. In effect, their plan is to have Ukraine become an autonomous Jewish domain, a small-scale successor to the medieval empire of Khazaria. It would be called in Yiddish, Khazaria. By lining up with the Syrian rebels and Ukraine, as well as Georgia and Azerbaijan, also part of the ancient Khazarian territory, one source explains, Netanyahu, quote, puts pressure on both Syria and Russia, end quote.
So I would like to draw people's attention to many things you can see regarding Germany at the beginning of World War II with Hitler, meeting with the Pope of the time and the Roman Catholic Church and many, many bishops, kissing the ring, and they're saluting him with the Sieg Heil, Hail Satan salute. That's very substantial and very symbolic of the truth of what is said here.
Tartaria, a very famous Russian online news portal, regnum.ru, contains a large amount of historical information, including this amazing map of the ancient world that includes Tartaria. So you can see there in the map.
You can see it located between the Black and Caspian Seas. Again, Black and Caspian here.
This second map of Tartaria, next page, is a modern version of the ancient Framaro map. On this map, Tartaria is located in the same place that Khazaria was found on the previous map.
So this is a much more easy to read map. You can see here the entire outline of it. Again, the Black Sea and the Caspian and Tartaria here.
Tartaria was erased off the world maps in the 18th century by the Khazarian Mafia, or KM. The Jesuits were heavily involved in this destruction. The grandchildren of the KM were also very active in demolishing Tartaria in order to reestablish their power. Tartaria was a Confederate trade network of diverse peoples located in the Northern Hemisphere. It was simply erased at the beginning of the 1900s by the KM, destroying or hiding all maps referencing Tartaria. Tartaria and its history were simply not taught or discussed anymore. This effectively erased it from the world's history and knowledge. Obviously, Tartaria is not a specific state, but a kind of mythologized land that never had exact boundaries. The toponym Tartaria disappeared from geographical maps at the beginning of the 19th century, but it did not disappear without a trace. Tartaria has appeared in fiction, newspaper articles, and popular science books. The fact that in Europe Tartaria was associated with Russia for a long time is evidenced by Jules Verne's novel Mikhail Strogoff.
In this novel, and it's fascinating to know that Jules Verne didn't only write science fiction. I did not know that until this Decode by Sonorata. He's going into a lot of amazing information associating to Tartaria. So other non-terrestrial beings helped in truncating Tartaria's timeline and melding it into ours now. The civilization was on the verge of space travel and had already accomplished free energy and anti-gravitics. Thus, the KM and other groups simply could not allow for them to continue, or would it end their ability to usher in the New World Order, because the two timelines or two Earths were too closely associated. Details of this will be discussed in future decodes.
In the beginning of the 19th century, a period of mud floods were created, as well as several wars and other events that made it easy for the KM to rewrite parts of Tartaria history. Evidence of this includes the Mississippi flowing backwards in 1812, many buildings and people disappearing worldwide, the existence of many buildings all over the world that show they were constructed during the time of Tartaria, buildings half or fully under the surface of the ground, due to the mud floods on the timeline. Old photographs of this era that show cities with very few to no one in them, as well as pictures that show people who are 8 feet tall or more. These people are from the Tartaria timeline. Tartaria was a highly developed society, a peaceful, self-sustaining one that used very advanced technologies, but it became dangerous for the global elite, the Khazarian mafia, and therefore was eliminated. 2 good items breaking this down are the Andreas Zertos video and item, which are in the links below. On 15 January 2013, Russian President Vladimir Putin inaugurated a new archive where Tartaria maps are made available to the public. You may ask, what's so interesting about the above? A lot. This act demonstrates to the world that Russia is embarking on a journey of revealing this truth, non-fake cabal history. It is aware that a nation that does not know its history cannot have a future. The current official Russian history, as taught in schools, was created in the 18th century, written in accordance with the biblical Zionist concept of history.
And the important thing here is it's a Zionist concept where they're twisting the Bible to fit, and they did not want this truth. And you can see now Putin putting that truth back in, because without knowing our history of the human race and the peoples, the only history we have is one in which they can rewrite it and make it fit their narrative for their New World Order.
The Zionists' decision to transition from the true original calendar, which is counted from the peace agreement signed in the Star Temple, to the Julian calendar in itself was enough to shorten the history of this realm or timeline by more than 5,500 years. In the last 20 years, the Russian Federation has been working on a completely new concept of education, with history books created for this country, where the majority of people are Slavic. They are leaving behind the selfish reasons of Western educational institutions and so-called non-profit organizations. Sadly, many people have never heard of the largest country to have existed on Earth, Tartaria. Although we learned about the famous Egyptian, Persian, Ottoman, and Roman empires, all of them were small in comparison to the huge Slavic empire known by various names over the ages on this timeline. Rushania, then Scotia, and finally Tartaria. It is quite surprising that this country does not have even a single mention of it in official world history. But this does reflect their power and vast infiltration into the seats of world power. This information gap is now being filled in a bit by some historians, such as Yelena Lyubimova and Dmitry Mylnikov, as well as others. The vast Tartarian Empire lasted a long time and occupied a vast area on Earth, spanning several continents. It had millions of inhabitants and created a self-sustaining free energy culture based on the spiritual and moral qualities of man. Respect for ancestors, justice, respect for family, and love for their homeland were their primary principles. Despite being removed or not mentioned in current history books and teachings and attempts to erase it from maps, nonetheless Tartaria is still displayed on many old maps and mentioned in at least one ancient encyclopedia, see below. The Tartarians who originally inhabited Tartaria were tall, red-haired, white-skinned people with blue, green, or gray eyes. They were the Slavs, Aryans, and Russians. They were known to be friendly and kind in times of peace, brave and merciless in battles, righteous and compassionate in the days of victory and steadfast in adversity. They fought for the most sacred thing to them, moral purity. Their love of their homeland and their faith made them almost invincible. Encyclopedia Britannica's first edition, episode 3, Edinburgh, 1771, page 887, says the following about Tartaria. Quote, "From the Urals to Alaska, from New Earth to Tibet, Tartaria was a great country in northern Asia, bounded by Siberia in the north and called Great Tartaria in the west. The natural boundaries of the realm that we now know as Tartaria, which occupied almost the entire northern hemisphere in ancient times, were ocean shores, three of them, ice, silent, and Atlantic, which were actually its inland waters." Of the very peoples of Tartaria, it states, quote, "The Tartarians living south of Moscovia and Siberia were called Astrachans and Cherkes. Dagestanians lived northwest of the Caspian Sea. Kalmy Tartars named those who inhabited the territory between Siberia and the Caspian Sea the Uzbek Tartarians. The Moguls inhabited the land north of Persia and India, and finally, Tibetan Tartarians lived northwest of China." Quote end. All of this was true until the 18th century. Suddenly, as if with the waving of an evil wizard's magic wand, Tartaria disappeared. Why didn't this great empire leave a few less important states behind, as is usually the case with the breakdown of empires? Where did its millions of inhabitants go? Why can we find no mention of this amazing territory in most of today's history books? Tartaria suddenly disappeared from maps, books, and memories. As mentioned previously, the world's largest empire, Tartaria, is shown on a map in a 1771 publication of Encyclopedia Britannica that has disappeared from all its future editions. And all of these maps can be retrieved on the geoportal of the Russian Geographical Society.
The creation of Ukraine by the Habsburg Empire. In 1804, Emperor Franz II created the Austrian Empire, also known as the Habsburg Empire, in response to the creation of Napoleon's empire and in opposition to it. Before that, it was called the Habsburg Monarchy. The Austrian Empire included the hereditary possessions of the Habsburg family, including Hungary, Czechia with Moravia and Bohemia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, parts of Ukraine, Poland, Romania, and Serbia. The empire was the second largest political state after Russia. The formation of the Austrian Empire brought with it a number of rather acute problems. The foremost of these was that Austria was becoming the most multinational state in Western and Central Europe. More than a dozen nationalities were included in its territory, none of which could be considered a majority. Germans, for example, made up less than a quarter of the population and were scattered throughout the territory of the empire. In 1848, the Hungarian uprising took place, and this Hungarian question was eventually resolved in 1867, when the Austrian Empire was transformed into a dual Austro-Hungarian monarchy. Both parts of the state, Austria and Hungary, were headed by a single monarch from the Habsburg dynasty, which each land, Austrian Cisleithania and Hungarian Transleithania, had its own parliament, an elected and independent government, and its own system of state administration, courts, and justice. Foreign policy, defense and military issues, financial and custom systems all remained at the general imperial level. After the transformation of the Austrian Empire into the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, Transcarpathia, today's Ukraine, became part of the Hungarian part of the state, while Galicia, also part of today's Ukraine, and Bukovina, today part of Ukraine and Romania, remained Austrian. The Rusyn Russians living in Galicia, capital Lviv, today's Ukraine, Transcarpathia, and Bukovina represented the majority of all people living in these areas. They were the peasantry in the 17th and until the 18th centuries and had absolutely no rights. However, the disenfranchised position of the Rusyn living in Bukovina and Transcarpathia partly protected them from the cultural and religious breakdown that impacted the representatives of the local intelligentsia. This made it possible to preserve their spoken Russian language and culture throughout generations, and despite being an Uniate, a Christian community member, to follow the canons of the Orthodox faith. This is a picture that shows the Russian peasants in Galicia in 1896. The local landlord elite paid almost no attention to the language and way of life of their serfs. But the social position of the peasants was unenviable. Their exploitation in the Polish estates of Galicia, for example, reached such a level that the corvée free workers on the land of the landowners reached 312 days a year. As a result, the serfs had only 50 days to provide themselves with food and clothing for the whole year. Subsequently, the policy of unifying laws throughout the territory controlled by the Habsburgs led to an improvement in the situation for the peasants. In 1775, a patent by the Austrian Empress Maria Theresia limited corvée unpaid labor to 3 days a week. In 1781, the so-called patent on subjects of Emperor Joseph II further softened the oppressions of the landowners. The peasants were freed from service in the master's court and received the right to move from one landowner to another, to freely marry, learn crafts, and go to the cities. These small steps towards helping the Rusyn led to a significant support by the Rusyns of the Austrian authorities, who needed it due to the activation of anti-Austrian-minded Poles. Since Napoleon sought to short-circuit his Austrian and Prussian opponents with the help of the Polish factor, Austria drastically needed some kind of check on Polish activity. Therefore, they adopted the Latinization of the word Russians, rutens, ruteni. The Austrians got this word from the medieval Polish historians. Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph wrote to his mother, quote, "Our future is in the East, and we will drive the power and influence of Russia into those limits beyond which it has gone only because of weakness and confusion in our camp. Slowly, preferably imperceptibly for Tsar Nicholas, but surely we will bring Russian policy to collapse. Of course, it is not good to oppose old friends, but in politics it is impossible otherwise, and our natural enemy in the East is Russia." Quote end. In 1848, the governor of Galicia, Austrian Franz Seraph Stadion von Wathausen received representatives of the Galician Ruthenian public and made them understand that the Ruthenians could count on help from the government only if they became an independent people and refused national unity with Russia. For some time, the government of the Austrian Empire considered two possible options for a national policy towards the Ruthenes. The first option involved the creation of a separate Ruthenian people. But in the end, the second option prevailed. It was decided to create a Ukrainian nation, declaring the national unity of the Ruthenians and the Russian population to be called Little Russia. Even now, Ukraine is still called Little Russia. The attraction to the Ruthenes to Russia became one of the factors that influenced the growing tensions in relations between Austria and the Russian Empire. Also, the fact that Austria took the side of the opponents of Russia, Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and the Kingdom of Sardinia, the Allies, in the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, and presented an ultimatum to Nicholas I in early June 1854 for the immediate withdrawal of Russian troops from the Danubian principalities, further weakened the relations between Austria and Russia. Russia was forced to withdraw troops from the Balkans, but instead of the expected strengthening of its position, Vienna found itself in international isolation.
A specialist in the history of European diplomacy of the 19th and 20th centuries, A. Taylor wrote, quote, "The Crimean War left Austria without friends. Russia attributed its defeat to Austria's threats to join the Allies. The Allies believed that Russia would have given in without fighting if Austria had joined the Allies at the onset of the conflict." End quote. Later in the 20th century, an associate of Yusuf Pilsudski V. Brachowski wrote about this again, saying, quote, "To the question as to whether the Ukrainian people exist, we answer, if the Ukrainian people did not exist, but only the ethnographic mass, then it would be necessary to help it achieve national consciousness. For what and why? Because the East does not have to deal with 90 million Great Russians, plus 40 million Little Russians, undivided among themselves and united nationally, could cause a danger to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire." End quote. The more tense relations between Austria, Hungary, and the Russian Empire became, the more intense and wider was the propaganda of Ukrainianization among the Ruthenians. By 1870, relations between Austria-Hungary and the Russian Empire had heated up so much that among the highest circles of the Danubian monarchy, the possibility of starting a war with Russia was seriously considered. In 1870, Count Andressy, Hungary's leading statesman and future foreign minister of the monarchy, stated, quote, "Like every person in Hungary, I consider a clash between Austria-Hungary and Russia inevitable." End quote. The growth of strategic tension in relations between Austria-Hungary and Russia led the leadership of Austria-Hungary to become more and more active in pursuing a policy of the separation of southwestern Russia from Russia. This contributed to both the suppression of Russophile sentiments and the propaganda of separatism in Little Russia, activated by Austria-Hungary in order to tear this piece of territory from the Russian Empire and introduce it into its own empire, calling it United Ukraine. Emperor Franz Joseph, while still a young monarch, made a bet on the rollback of Russia to the east. This event that led to the realization of the Austria-Hungary policy of Ukrainianization of the Ruthene was announced by Emperor Joseph half a century prior to its actual occurrence. Anti-Russian Ukrainian separatism in Austria-Hungary was patronized by Crown Prince Franz Ferdinand and the Ministry of War. In 1910, a secret meeting was held in the castle Konopski, which at that time was the home of Archduke Franz Ferdinand d'Este. It was his favorite home. The Archduke attended the meeting himself, as well as figures of the Ukrainian movement from Galicia and Little Russia, Yevhen Olesnitsky, Andrei Sheptytsky, Yevgen Chikalenko, and Nikolai Mishrovsky. This meeting on the Ukrainian issue was by no means the only one. At the end of July 1914, another secret meeting of senior officials took place. This meeting was again attended by Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, who was instructed to prepare and send recommendations to the Austrian and German governments for their future policies to tear Little Russia from Russia. On August the 15th, he wrote a memorandum to the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph entitled Ukrainianization, stating that the regions of Little Russia, quote, may be more completely torn away from Russia and give them the character of a national region, sympathetic to the population, independent from Russia, alien to the power of the Tsars, end quote. Austria, Hungary, and Germany were seriously preparing for the implementation of their plans, a very detailed and thorough preparation. For example, the candidacy of the future king of occupied Ukraine was considered. They decided upon Archduke Wilhelm Franz Habsburg, who had been trained for the role of king since his youth. Wilhelm Franz Habsburg spoke the Ukrainian language, wore an embroidered shirt under the Austrian military uniform, and commanded a cavalry regiment of Galician Rusins. Anti-Russian Ukrainians called their future king Wilhelm Vasily Vyshevny.
So, it's important to notice the spelling here. When you see the word Tsar spelled T-S-A-R, that refers to Russian rulers. C-Z-A-R means generically it could be a ruler, and it more often refers to a ruler that's not Russian. So it's actually a more definitive term, and Tsar's C-Z-A-R is more ambiguous, but it leans towards not being of Russia. So here's a beautiful picture of Wilhelm in an embroidered shirt under the Australian military uniform.
As a result, the Austrian commander-in-chief, Archduke Friedrich, in a memorandum to Emperor Franz Joseph, was forced to admit that Russian troops were perceived by the Rusins as liberators, and that the Russians could count on full support, in quotations, from the local population. On August the 1st, 1914, the First World War began. On August 31st, 1914, Baron Geisel, a representative of the Austrian Foreign Affairs, told the following to the Austrian Foreign Ministry after negotiating with the leaders of Ukrainian organizations in Lvov. Quote, "The Ukrainophile movement among the population has no basis. There are only leaders without parties." End quote. In one of the subsequent messages, Geisel called Galician Ukrainianism, quotations, an exclusively theoretical construction of politicians, end quote. And after the entry of the Russian army into the territory of Galicia, Geisel informed the Austrian leadership about the mass transition of the Rusins to the side of the Russian troops, as a result of which the Austrian army was, in the words of Geisel, quotations, abandoned to the mercy of fate, end quote. In November of 1914, Berchtold, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Austro-Hungary, shared his plans. Quotation, The main goal in this war is the long-term weakening of Russia, and therefore, in the event of our victory, we will begin to create an independent Ukraine state from Russia." End quote.
So it's important to see that nothing ever changes. They never vary from their playbook. This is the exact same strategy they're doing today. It's now just NATO, the US, and the EU using Ukraine as a tool to, again, as this quote said, weaken Russia and create an independent Ukrainian state, independent from who? NATO, ES, and EU would rule it with absolute despotic power. The ploy is ending. We are now seeing their last attempt fail. So again, please watch the Ukrainian envisioning that was led by the Europe team.
Despite such a successful start of the war and the support of the Ruthenians, the Russian troops were soon forced to retreat from the territory of Austro-Hungary. In his book, The Red Prince, dedicated to Wilhelm Habsburg, Yale professor Timothy Snyder states, quotations, "Wilhelm first identified himself with the Jews, and only later with the Ukrainians. Willie drew up a project for an Israeli state, with which he addressed the World Zionist Organization in Berlin, offering his services. One can imagine how he arrived at such an idea. Zionism, the idea of returning the Jews to Palestine and founding a Jewish state, was gaining supporters at this time. In 1913, the 11th Zionist Congress was held in Vienna, where Willie then lived. In that case, Willie's move to Vienna should have been the final moment in his own discovery of the nation." End quote.
What connected Tito, Hitler, Stalin, and Freud during 1913 in Vienna? Maybe this Congress, in the link below. Perhaps the younger offspring of the side branch of the Habsburgs, who actually had no chance of the throne, dreamed of becoming the king of Israel. In the end, his dreams were not completely groundless. The Habsburgs, among other titles, bore the title of Kings of Jerusalem, although the Kingdom of Jerusalem had long since disappeared from the world map. However, the Zionists showed no interest in the project proposed by the young Habsburg, and then he, no longer evading, followed the Ukrainian path. Wilhelm Habsburg, born in 1895 in Croatia, on an island in the Adriatic Sea, where his father had a palace, lived in the family castle in western Galicia from the age of 12. Here he learned the Ukrainian language and became addicted to reading the works of Grushevsky, Shevchenko, and Franco. After the counter-offensive of the Russian army in Galicia in the summer of 1916, Wilhelm was recalled from the front and temporarily sent to the rear in order to improve his health. At the end of 1916, Charles I became the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, following Emperor Franz Joseph. He was only 8 years older than Wilhelm. Good relations were established between them. On February 2, 1917, Wilhelm presented his Ukrainian project to Charles I. Wilhelm's proposal was to create a Ukrainian principality, or Ukrainian kingdom, from eastern Galicia after winning the war. Wilhelm Vasil saw a renewed Habsburg Empire consisting of the Austrian, Hungarian, Polish kingdoms, Bohemia, and Ukraine.
So you can see here their coat of arms difference, very slight, of the Habsburgs and the Kaiser, and the Ostrich and the Lothringen. So you can see the shield is varied a little bit from having 1 to 2 of the lion type creature things shown here, and a slight difference in color. And then you have an interesting addition there. So it's how they do symbology is these little differences have a lot of meaning. If you remember Epstein Island, peacocks are very important in their understanding of things and their worshiping of what they worship.
He himself claimed the role of monarch, or at least regent, of Galicia. In July to August 1917, Wilhelm accompanied Emperor Charles I on a trip to eastern Galicia. A few weeks later, Charles I sent Wilhelm to Lvov to meet and establish contact with Andrei Sheptytsky, head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. The interests of Sheptytsky and Habsburg converged. Both wanted to promote the Catholic faith to the east and establish a monarchy in Ukraine. Soon after, the armies of Germany and Austro-Hungary occupied most of Ukraine. Germany got Kiev and the northern regions. The Habsburgs occupied the southern regions. 2 diplomatic missions were opened in Kiev. Both Austro-Hungary and Germany, being in a difficult economic situation, sought primarily to use Ukraine as a source of food and labor, and even Hitler also used Ukraine for that reason. In 1918, when Austro-Hungary was living out its last months, the empire tried to implement a similar, already well-established model for establishing a semi-colonial kingdom in Ukraine. The son of Karl Stefan Habsburg, Wilhelm Habsburg, aka Vasil Vyzhyvany, his Ukrainian name, was offered the role of monarch of Ukraine. Germany was ready to support a puppet government, which could fulfill its enslaving obligations to supply the Reich with what it badly needed.
We see this colonialism again in Ukraine, of the Klaus Schwab kind of neo-globalist, neocon wanting their new world order, but seeing it falling, are trying to create a colonial kingdom in Ukraine, colonial kingdom, this time with NATO, the Western world, to try to salvage and stay their fall of the New World Order into the Fair World Order, from a unipolar world to a multipolar world in which the freedom of peoples and the recognizing of their independent countries is always the case, as in the envisioning we held.
Wilhelm was well aware of how important the task of Ukrainization of the population was, and strenuously worked to solve this problem. He said, quote, "There are only 2 possibilities. Either the enemy will be able to expel me and start Russification, or I will stay and start Ukrainization." Quote end. Wilhelm gained popularity among the Ukraine peasants because he prevented the seizure of food by the Austrian army. German military leaders reported on, quote, "the growing popularity of Archduke Wilhelm, popularly known as Vasil," quote end. There is still a statue of Wilhelm Habsburg standing in Kiev, as you can see in this picture right in front of us. In 1917, the Russian Romanov dynasty left the historical scene. In 1918, the same fate befell the Habsburg dynasty. In October of 1918, Wilhelm left Ukraine. He first went to Poland, then to Vienna, Austria, where Wilhelm began to act as a Ukrainian poet and publicist. In 1921, under the pseudonym Vasil Vyzhyvany, Wilhelm published a collection of poems in Ukrainian called The Days Pass. In the 1930s, Wilhelm had contact with the leader of the OUN, which is an organization whose activities are banned in the Russian Federation, Yevgeny Konovalets, and his successor Andrei Melnik. Both Konovalets and Melnik fought together with Wilhelm in 1918. Stefan Bandera was also part of the OUN. Plans to unite Little Russia with Galicia were never to be realized. In 1918, the allied Ukrainian state, which included Germany and Austria, was created and was briefly headed by Hetman Pavlo Skorobatsky. The Hetman state was a state formation that arose in 1918 and lasted for several months. Pavlo Skorobatsky, quote, "the nobility pan-hetman of all Ukraine," quote end, wrote in his memoirs that Antony Krapovitsky, Metropolitan of Kiev and Galicia, offered him anointing to the kingdom. The anointing did not take place. But, although already in exile, this did not prevent Skoropadsky's supporters from developing the concept of Ukrainian monarchism. In the 1930s, Skoropadsky, who lived in Germany, met Hitler several times. The Directory of the Ukrainian People's Republic, UNR, which came to power on 14th December 1919 after the overthrow of the headman of the Ukrainian state, Skoropadsky. It was headed by Vinichenko, who was previously the chairman of the UNR government. Petliura became commander-in-chief of the Army of the Directory. On 22nd January 1919, the UNR created a single Ukraine state with its capital in Kiev. Thanks to the accomplished unification, Wilhelm Vyzhyvany became a colonel in the UNR army. However, independent, conciliar Ukraine did not last long. By 5th of February 1919, the Bolsheviks occupied Kiev. As a result of the 1918 to 1921 hostilities and the subsequent redistribution of territories following the results of three wars, World War I, the Civil War, and the Soviet-Polish War, Galicia became part of Poland, Bukovina went to Romania, and Transcarpathia went to Czechoslovakia. In all these three territories of southwestern Russia, the authorities of the respective states tried, as a blueprint, to carry out complete Polonization, Romanization, or Czechization. But they met with stubborn resistance from the Rusyns, so they embarked instead on their plan of constructing a Ukrainian national identity. Otto Habsburg tried very hard to push Ukraine into the EU. His son, Karl Habsburg, the current head of the House of Habsburg, owns a radio station in the Ukraine and is still pushing this agenda. This is the same agenda we now see the entire Western world of NATO, the EU, the United Kingdom, and the US pushing relentlessly.
Great Russia, Russia, Little Russia, Ukraine, Novorussia, Russia, Ukraine, White Russia, Belarus. Ukraine translates to outskirts and was named when it was still part of Greater Russia, Little Russia, or Novorussia. When the administrative borders between the republics of the USSR turned into real borders in 1991, 8 million ethnic Russians became Ukrainians on paper. Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, 1629 to 1676, was proclaimed king of all Great Russia, Small Russia, what is now Ukraine, and White Russia, what is now Belarus. He began a grueling 13-year war with Poland, which ended in a partial victory. The land on the left bank of Dnieper ceded to Russia, and the Russian kingdom bought Kiev, the ancient capital of Russia, for 146,000 silver rubles and 7 tons of silver, which were divided among the richest Polish families. The word Ukraine as a toponym was not used at all during this period. Both in Russian and in Polish, it meant outskirts or borderland. Its use as a name for the territories around Kiev only began in the 18th century, when these lands really became a border area during the constant wars between Russia and Turkey. By the middle of the 18th century, the integration of Little Russians and Russia was extremely close. Under Empress Catherine II, Catherine the Great, 1762 to 1796, the steppes of southern Russia were resolutely won from the Tartars and Turks, and together with Prince Potemkin, she founded a new part of Russia there, Novorussia.
So you can see Novorussia in the map. This is a beautiful map. It has the dates of when things were annexed. So you can see the Moldovan and also now the the Sinistria area that's under controversy again, that Putin and the Russian leadership is saying is becoming unruly and all kinds of problems there, and NATO is pushing, and you can see the Galicia area spoken of here, the Vlishnaya, Crimea, 1954 annexation, the USSR, Ukraine border upon independence, 1919, etc. So this is a very powerful map to study. You can see the Donbass region, all of what is now under dispute in this conflict. So this is a very excellent map for people to study and look at. And thank you for finding this, Samrata.
The population of this area was extremely diverse. Russians, Greeks, Serbs, and many Germans invited by the Empress, who herself was a German princess. In fact, Novorossiya bore little resemblance to the old Little Russia. Novorossiya was the Russian equivalent of the New World. In the 19th century, industry actively developed in the city now called Donetsk. Trade flourished in Odessa and in Sevastopol, and Crimea resort areas began to sprout mixed with naval bases. During the three partitions of Poland, in which Russia participated along with Prussia and the Austrian Empire, Catherine II finally completed the work begun by Alexei Mikhailovich. Russia reunited almost all the lands that belonged to ancient Russia, along with their peasant population who preserved the Russian language and preserved Orthodox Christian traditions. The inhabitants of these territories began to return to their Russian identity. The great Russian writer Dostoevsky, 1821 to 1881, once wrote, quote, "The owner of the Russian land is only Russia. Great Russia, Little Russia, Belarus. It doesn't matter." Quote end. In August 1948, the US National Security Council issued a memorandum called NSC 20 per 1, 1948, at the request of then Secretary of Defense Admiral James Forrestal. The document described America's goals for the Soviet Union. A significant part of the memorandum was devoted to Ukraine. American analysts were convinced that the territory was an integral part of Greater Russia, and it was unlikely that Ukrainians could exist as an independent nation. Most importantly, this memorandum report notes that any support for the separatists will be met with sharp backlash from the Russians. Quote, "The economy of Ukraine is inextricably intertwined with that of Russia as a whole. An attempt to carve it out of the Russian economy and single it up as something separate would be as artificial and as destructive as an attempt to separate the Corn Belt, including the Great Lakes industrial area, from the economy of the United States. Finally, we cannot be indifferent to the feelings of the great Russians themselves. They will continue to be the strongest national element in that general area under any status. The Ukrainian territory is as much a part of their national heritage as the Middle West is of ours, and they are conscious of that fact. A solution which attempts to separate the Ukraine from the rest of Russia is bound to incur their resentments and opposition, and can be maintained in the last analysis only by forced. Quote end.
Yeah, exactly what we see going on right now.
Ukraine made by Lenin, unmade by Putin. Territories annexed to the Ukraine. The map above shows the area gifted to Ukraine by Lenin in 1922 in blue, which contains not just the rebel city of Luhansk, but also a stretch of land all the way to the Black Sea port of Odessa and beyond to the present-day border of Romania. Also included in green are the areas attached to Ukraine by Stalin before and after the Second World War, aka the Great Patriotic War in the former Soviet Union. This area also includes the previous Polish city of Lviv, also known as Lvov, Lemberg, Lemberek, Lviv, Livrad, and Leopolis, an indication of the area's many overlapping cultures, and a former Austro-Hungarian and Czechoslovakian area known as Transcarpathia. Also in purple is Crimea, previously an Ottoman vassal state. The Crimean Peninsula was annexed by Russia in 1783. It remained part of Russia until Khrushchev transferred it from Russia to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic in 1954. That transfer celebrated the 300th anniversary of Ukraine's reunification with Russia, as per the Treaty of Pereyaslav in 1654, and expressed the boundless trust and love the Russian people feel toward the Ukrainian people. It was a natural consequence of the territorial, economic, and cultural proximity between Crimea and Ukraine.
So it's important to understand this quote in light of Putin's recent speeches, that they look at the Ukrainian people and love and as Russian people, and this whole Ukrainian separatism and all of this, as you can see the history throughout this document put together by Sarata, is very important to understand what's going on in Ukraine. They fomented this for hundreds of years, and we're talking that from the Maidan coup that they've been at war, but actually this has been a work to destroy Russia, Russian people, weaken Russia, the greater Russia, and to pull Ukraine into a colony for them, the KM.
Kiev. Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen government, said in many of his telegram posts that they will go for Kiev. Kadyrov is the Chechen president, and his army is the leading force for the Special Military Operation, or SMO, for Russia in the Ukraine. Dmitry Medvedev said in an interview on 21 July 2022 that Ukraine could be erased from the world map. Is Kiev the mother of all Russian cities? And there's a link there. Ancient chronicles called Kiev the mother of Russian cities, highlighting its preeminence over other population centers in ancient Rus. In contemporary Ukraine, however, the adjective Russian is not received well. The government in Kiev and radical elements of Ukrainian society try hard to distance themselves from anything Russian. Scholars continue to debate when the city was founded. The traditional founding date is 482 CE, so the city celebrated its 1500th anniversary in 1982. Archaeological data indicates a founding in the 6th or 7th centuries. Some researchers date the founding to as late as the late 9th century. Kiev might be erased from the world map, according to Dmitry Medvedev.
So Belarus sides with Russia in the Special Military Operation, SMO, against Ukraine. Together with Russia, we are creating a single powerful independent state. That was Alexander Grigorovich Lukashenko said that. He said that Belarus was part of the Soviet Union until 1991 and is the current president of Belarus. He was tried to be overthrown and the color revolution. He was originally more leaning towards the US and the Western world, but when they tried to kill him and to do a coup and to take over his government, he completely aligns now with Russia. And that person, that lady, is actually now been taken and convicted. And if she goes back to Belarus, she'll be arrested and put in jail for 20 years into prison. She's outside Belarus, but this is now recognized that she tried to overthrow and have Lukashenko killed. So as Lukashenko said in an interview with a Hungarian magazine, Mendiner, probably did not pronounce that right, sorry, quote, "I decided a long time ago that we would participate in the operation," end quote. July 3rd, 2022 at 3:28 p.m., quote, "We have stood by our Russian brothers and it will remain so. I made a decision about our participation in the special operation against Ukraine a long time ago," quote end, said Belarusian president on Sunday. And you can see him here in the picture below. Speaking on the occasion of Belarus's Independence Day on July 3rd, Lukashenko said, quote, "Russians and Belarusians have been cooperating military for a long time. We are the only country that supports Russia in this struggle. To those who criticize, I ask, did they not know that we are the closest allies of the Russian Federation?" Quote end. He then added, quote, "Together with Russia, we will create a single, powerful, and independent state," quote end. The link for that is below. The Road to War and the War. Very well documented information on the Ukraine war is in this link. CIA operations in Ukraine. I've spoken to this in many interviews. This document is pivotal to understanding how long the CIA, the clowns in America, have worked to turn Ukraine into a vassalary state of the West, of the New World Order crowd, of the Davos and all of that group. The CIA prepared for war in the Donbass as early as 1957 as part of an anti-Soviet uprising from military columnist Alexander Otomonov. In the 1960s, the CIA planned special operations in Ukraine. According to American analysts, the anti-Soviet insurgency would have been supported in many regions of the USSR, and the split for and against Moscow would have been roughly along the same border that today separates the Donbass People's Republic, DPR, Luhansk People's Republic, LPR, and the Crimea from the rest of Ukraine. So you can see they've been working since the 1960s. It's nothing at all that they're saying this SMO is Russia going in. No, they've been planning, and as Merkel and van der Leyen and many have said, the Minsk Accords were just to delay the, so they could build this up. And they've been building it up since the night, as this document said. We looked into this, and these conclusions are easily drawn from the recently declassified 1956 CIA study entitled Resistance Factors and Special Forces Zones of Operation Ukraine, and is extensively quoted by the BBC. This document, the BBC quite often mentions this. They've been fortifying this since this time. Thus, why Bakhmut is so fortified. And it is the hub of their first major defense line. It's the center of the entire thing. The study divides Ukraine into 12 zones. Each are based on their degree of loyalty to the American interventionists. Their mission was to incite an uprising against the central government. As expected, the western part of the country, particularly the Volyn region and Lutsk region, which includes cities such as Kabul, Lutsk, Kostopol, and Volodymyr, were deemed most promising. Crimea and the Donbass, on the other hand, were already described as unpromising because the local population supports the central government and considers itself Russian rather than Ukrainian. zones 1 and 2 on this map below. So you can see why, after the Minsk Accords, they began bombarding Donbass, and why Russia had to go take back Crimea, as this document, and we have read to you, that Crimea is long time been part of Russia. So you can see here in the CIA document that their plans, and they delineated the special zones of all based on the feasibility study here. It was the conflict between zones 3 through 12 and zones 1 and 2 that was described in 1957 as the most likely and potentially feasible conflict to break out, i.e., to be created within the USSR. However, there are also zones 3, 4, and 5, Odessa, Kharkiv, and Zaporozhye, where the CIA believed in 1957 would side with the Donbass if the conflict broke out. And we see that's exactly true, what's going on. And this is why I stated that Odessa, Russia will likely push to Odessa and offer a unconditional surrender and allow Ukraine to maintain part of Odessa so they can have shipping. But now with the West statements, they want to take Russia apart. They want to end Putin. They want to do this and take it all apart. That's likely no longer the case. It is interesting to evaluate that map of Ukraine prepared by the CIA in 1957 and note how the US plan was implemented 60 years later. Over 60 years later. Another process the neocon satanic globalists did to get Ukraine as their stronghold was Nazification and Satanization. The second part of this decode will elucidate on this. So I invite people to go study that CIA document at this link above. This is very important to understand so that you really understand if you're promoting sending weapons and billions of dollars to Ukraine, learn what is the truth in Ukraine. What have they done there? Why have they done it there? How long has this really been going on? Most of the people in the Western world, you ask them where Kiev or Lviv is, or you ask them where the Dnieper is, or you ask them anything about the history, where's Donetsk, where's Luhansk, where's Odessa, they haven't a clue. You're supporting something you know nothing about. You need to know about it and find out the truth. Many people in Berlin are now protesting this because they see how we've been played. Thank you for joining us. Join us for part 2 coming very soon. Thank you and God bless.